listener production.
Hi, I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Welcome to the briefing for another week. Protesters have marched in cities and regional centres across Australia this past weekend, demanding action on gender-based violence. This year, a woman has been lost every 4 days, allegedly at the hands of a man. That's 27 since January 1st. Included in that figure are the 5 women who were killed at Bondi Junction 2 weeks ago. These are some of the worst stats we've ever seen in the country. So what's being done about it?
It needs to be taken seriously, and I think you have old white men making these decisions who aren't really listening to issues around women's safety. They're just not taking it seriously.
On today's briefing, we speak with a victim survivor of domestic violence about what she and others like her want to see change. First though, here are the headlines with Katrina Blowers. It is Monday, the 29th of April.
Hey, Sacha. Hi, everyone. Tens of thousands of people have taken to the streets across Australia over the weekend, marching for an end to violence against women. These protests come, as we've just heard, after an increase in the number of women killed so far this year, allegedly at the hands of men. That number stands at 27, almost double when compared to the same time last year. Many people in the crowd held posters. They were also chanting things like, "We want action," and demanding governments to, quote, "do your job," while Prime Minister Antony Albanese made an impromptu appearance at the Canberra rally yesterday afternoon.
And this is a national crisis. We're here today to demand that governments of all levels must do better, including my own, including every state and territory government. We need to change the culture. We need to change attitudes.
As you can hear there, Katrina, there was a bit of a mixed reception, I feel. I think he got a lot of cheers and claps for making some, pretty serious statements about what he wanted to do and wanted to achieve. But he was also heckled. But in the wake of this appearance, he has called an urgent national cabinet meeting for this Wednesday, with violence against women to be the sole item on the agenda. Now, this does come as well after the government declined a royal commission into domestic violence, with the Attorney General saying they should instead focus on the National DV plan, which was agreed to in 2022. I think it's clear, Katrina, women are just fed up, and men as well who stand by them, and we need to see change in this space.
It was interesting, Anthony Albanese, in that grab that we just played, he spoke about, we need to change the culture, we need to change attitudes. And a lot of people who are working in this space say, look, the approach that we've been taking up until now just isn't working. First of all, trying to have conversations with young people in particular about that change. It's putting the onus on future generations for that change to occur. And obviously change needs to occur now. I've been hearing some super interesting conversations around the impact that damaging industries such as alcohol, gambling, porn and social media are having in this space, and the need for regulation to occur when we talk about domestic violence strategies. For example, many young people feel that pornography is normalizing painful or degrading sexual practices. And I've been hearing so much about how practices like choking have become quite mainstream. The E-Safety Commissioner has already made a regulation to set an age verification limit for online porn. The government hasn't fast-tracked or said when they're going to accept that. So that is another way, I guess, that we can progress other conversations in this space, Sacha.
I think we all have a responsibility as well. As you said, teaching the future generations is one thing, but we need change now, and that falls, I think, on all of us to be good citizens in our communities and to call things out when we see it. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we will be talking to a victim survivor in today's deep dive about the changes she thinks could make a difference.
Diplomatic efforts are being ramped up to try to facilitate a ceasefire in Gaza. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken will travel to Saudi Arabia as Hamas officials head to Egypt, where they're expected to provide a response to Israel's latest proposal. That includes an initial release of hostages, while some reports suggest it also includes a resolution to discuss restoring sustainable calm in Gaza. Now, if true, that would represent the first time Israel has been open to discussing an end to to the war. Hamas officials say they've received the proposal, they're reviewing it, but they're expected to insist that a deal must permanently end Israel's war on Gaza.
It also comes amid anger in Tel Aviv as more Israeli protesters took to the streets demanding the safety and return of hostages that are still being held in Gaza. Now, some in the crowd were also rallying against the planned ground invasion of Gaza's southernmost city of Rafah over fears for the hostages that still remain there. Meantime, in Rafah itself, Palestinians have expressed their thanks to student protesters in the US who have been rallying for an end to the war. We saw video from the Shabura refugee camp, which shows children holding banners with messages that read, "Students of Columbia University continue to stand by us," and "Violating our right to education and life is a war crime." And also some positive news, I suppose, Katrina, out of Gaza, the World Central Kitchen, which was the aid organisation that was targeted in that attack on a convoy, killing 7 people, including an Australian. They've said that they are ready to resume operations in Gaza, and they've got about 270 trucks waiting to enter the crossing at Rafah. And they're also looking at what they can do when it comes to deliveries by sea, because the US military has started construction of a floating pier off the coast. So work to get more desperately needed aid into Gaza.
Yeah, which would certainly be amazing, but I'm sure they would want the utmost assurances that not only their people but their operations are going to be safe. Australia's Defence Minister has spent the weekend in Ukraine, pledging an additional $100 million in aid funding. Richard Marles has travelled to the western city of Lviv, becoming just the second federal government minister to visit the country since Vladimir Putin's troops invaded in February 2022. He's promised Australia's support of Ukraine's efforts against Russia, saying it will continue until the war ends on Kyiv's terms.
We cannot afford to see Ukraine fail. Global peace and security is what's at stake.
Marles' trip coincided with another fierce round of Russian airstrikes, which have been targeting power facilities.
We also heard from Ukraine's PM, who thanked Australia for its friendship and its continued support, but also kind of ribbed Richard Marles a little bit, Katrina, saying that it's not happy that Australia decided not to reopen its embassy in Ukraine's capital. Instead, the ambassador is actually based out of Warsaw in Poland. And Marles has responded saying, you know, the reopening of the embassy is under active consideration. However, their focus right now is delivering this defence-based aid. And a watch belonging to the Titanic's richest passenger has sold at auction for a whopping 2.2 million Australian dollars. That's the most expensive item sold from the doomed ship ever. The pocket watch was found on the body of US business magnate John Jacob Astor and was returned to his family after the tragedy, and they've held it up until now. Now, this price, 2.2 mil, smashed pre-auction predictions that it would go for about 300,000 Australian, Katrina.
Yeah, I wonder why they sold it, because obviously this is an incredible family heirloom. It was repaired and was apparently, you know, fully operational, and it came with a bit of a love story. So John Jacob Astor was helping his wife into a lifeboat and then didn't have time to get to a lifeboat himself, and that's why he perished on board the Titanic. And as he said, he was one of the richest people in the world at the time. So, yeah, I'm just curious as to why they might have sold this memento. Everyone has their reasons, I guess. A violin bag belonging to the Titanic's bandmaster also went under the hammer. Now, this is the man who apparently encouraged musicians to play as the boat sank. According to survivors of the tragedy, it fetched just under $600,000. I know that the movie, the blockbuster movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, has definitely kept the mystery and allure of the Titanic story alive, but it's something that people still find so fascinating.
Yeah, well, it's the worst maritime disaster in history, peacetime maritime disaster in history. And it is. I was obsessed with the movie as a kid. I don't know how healthy that obsession was as a 6-year-old, but I really loved the love story of Jack and Rose. I had a cat called Leo DiCaprio, and a brother and sister. Yeah, and a brother and sister cat called Jack and Rose once we lost Leo. So yes, obsessed is probably an understatement. I don't know. I think it's just, it's just a really fascinating story, and I think the mystery of the ship sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic and no one can get to it is I suppose part of it and part of the allure of these amazing items that have survived.
Well, Sacha, I think if journalism doesn't work out for you, you have a strong career ahead of you in naming cats. Leonardo DiCaprio is one of the best cat names I have ever heard.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, I'm pretty proud of that one. Actually, I don't know how I came up with it. Katrina, thanks so much for being here for the headlines. Look, next up, we are going into a serious topic. We are talking about the domestic violence issue that is plaguing Australia at the moment. We're speaking to a victim survivor to tell us what she wants to happen. First off, a heads up, we'll be talking about domestic violence in today's interview. A woman has died in Australia, allegedly at the hands of a man, every 4 days in 2024. As we talked about in the headlines, major protests swept Australia over the weekend, with demands for immediate action, including calls for a national emergency to be declared. In response, Anthony Albanese has convened an emergency national cabinet meeting with the states and territories, with domestic violence to be the sole subject. That'll happen on Wednesday, and with just a couple of weeks until the budget is handed down, there are hopes for some immediate funding and programs to tackle the scourge that is gender-based violence. But what do victim survivors want? Is there something they think can make a difference that isn't being done yet? Joining me now is Kay Schubach. Kay is a survivor of the notorious Playboy Rapist, Simon Montero, a serial sex offender who has been convicted of rape, assault, property damage and breaches of supervision orders. She's lobbied politicians for reforms to better protect victim survivors from perpetrators released on bail and has written a book called Perfect Stranger about her own ordeal with domestic violence. Kay, thank you for being with us here today. The stats this year are some of the worst we've seen. A woman lost every 4 days to violence at the hands of a man. Does it feel like we're going backwards?
Oh, it seems to be the never-ending story. We've been advocating for 50 years to try and protect women at the hands of violence from men. And I think men are becoming more violent, but also, the fact that so many women are dying and we're just on this wheel. We don't seem to be able to effect reform, even though we know the answers, we know what to do, but it's like society just puts its head in the sand about violence against women.
Which is confusing because after a woman is killed in Australia, and as I said, it's happening every 4 days this year so far, the platitudes come thick and fast. The thoughts and prayers, the we're working hard, the, men need to do better. But what needs to be done right now, as in what is a change, in your opinion, that could be made tomorrow that would make a tangible difference?
I really believe that we need to change parole laws and bail laws. I think that is absolutely essential, and I advocated for that in 2017 with my perpetrator, who was due to get out after serving 9 years of a 12-year sentence, and he was up for parole, and everyone just seemed to believe that he had every right to parole and that he was imminently going to be let out, and I was just no. So I lobbied the Minister for Police, the Minister for Corrections, the Minister for Women, and ultimately the Attorney General, who was then Mark Speakman. But I also started a petition and raised nearly 50,000 signatures, and I took that to the State Parole Authority and basically plonked it on their desk when they were having the hearing for Simon. And I said, this is against community standards. You're supposed to be protecting the community, not protecting the rights of a high-risk recidivist sex offender. They didn't actually know what to do with it. They said, we're not sure if we can table this or not. And they kind of took it out the back, but they didn't actually allow him parole on that occasion and on, I think, 2 further occasions. So I feel that it did have an effect. Ultimately, they did let him out. It is a bit of a moot point as to whether our actions of protesting this actually are effective. But I think if we do it en masse, we have to convince the state parole authority that they can't play with women in society in this kind of social experiment that men will be reformed once they're out in the community. It just does not work.
Now, I spoke to an expert criminologist last week and I said, can't we just ban bail for repeat alleged offenders who are being accused of some of the most heinous crimes? Why should they be given access to bail? And he said to me, well, our jails would fill up too quickly. What's your response to something like that as a victim survivor?
Well, I mean, it's an egregious mistake to let some people out on bail. You know, I think you have old white men making these decisions who aren't really listening to, you know, issues around women's safety. They're just not taking it seriously. And there's also the case of kind of civil libertarians who are saying that defence lawyers need to be able to do their best jobs and let people out with the presumption of innocence. But it really has turned the other way. I think there is a societal understanding that the protections are for the perpetrators and the victims and general population aren't being protected. Their rights are not being looked after. Their rights are secondary to the perpetrators. I think we actually all feel that.
I suppose I can understand how the balance might be difficult in some circumstances to strike, in that we have a presumption of innocence in our justice system. However, when the risk is a woman dying, then which quote unquote wins in that situation? Are there programs or initiatives happening at the moment that you think are actually working and are making a difference at trying to drive down the rate of domestic violence?
Well, I think you do need to go back to men's behavioural change, and there has been an uptick in understanding how important that needs to be. And I think that, you know, that needs to be embedded into society at every level, from school upwards, about, you know, consideration and respect. Look, I'm not an expert on the programs that are in place at the moment, but I think there is more of an appetite for men's behavioural change. The language in the media, it is beginning to change. The media training and advice and those standards are now that we can't celebrate the perpetrator. We need to mourn the loss of life, and that it is violence that is perpetrated against the woman, not this, you know, this wonderful guy who's just had an aberration. You know, that kind of language needs to change as well. So it's multifaceted, complete societal change that needs to take place.
I want to get your thoughts on something that a listener reached out to us with. We put up a video of that chat I had with the criminologist, Dr. Terry Goldsworthy, last week. And this person commented on that and they said, and I'll read it out to you, what we do need is more support for the men who carry out domestic violence. I work with men and try to teach them during these vulnerable, emotional and stressful times, without the right support and tools to address the offending behaviours, the likelihood of and severity of offending increases. If we place a man on a domestic violence order, take away access to home, children, and maybe even the ability to work and support themselves, we increase those risks, essentially saying, of recidivism. Do you agree with that sentiment that we should be I know you've just kind of talked about programs about men's behaviour, but this is specifically working with offenders and supporting them. What do you make of that?
Again, I think it's a case-by-case issue, because you've got, like with my perpetrator, he's been described as belligerent, agitated, self-entitled, abusive, demanding and refusing to accept responsibility for his actions. So no amount of counselling is ever going to help him. He's a waste of space. Some men are truly remorseful for their acts, but it's deeply ingrained as well. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not an expert on what happens in those men's behavioural groups. But look, you do run the risk of making them more angry. And, you know, men's rights advocates say that we shouldn't be taking children away from men, but the responsibility has to be back on the perpetrator. You can't just keep rewarding the violent person in a relationship. Separation the courts, divorce courts, are full of really, really coercive, abusive behaviour that ultimately leads to discontent, to violence, to blaming each other, financial control. In the majority of cases, it's the woman who is the one who comes out on the bad end of the stick with this one, you know. It's very, very complicated, but I think if you've got someone with red flags who is showing no signs of remorse or recognition of their behaviour, then you just need to be severe. They need to, you know, stay incarcerated. They need to work through their anger, and someone needs to deem that they're not reformed. Until they're reformed, they should not be back in community. You know, what happens? They get out on bail and they drive straight to the woman that they're angry with and murder them.
I guess the problem there, though, and this is where this issue is so complicated, is that we can't lock people up indefinitely. It's, you know, you're given a sentence to serve and you serve it. But I think as we keep kind of finding in this conversation, the multifaceted aspects of it make it that much more complicated, which sucks because it's talking about women being murdered by men and it shouldn't be hard. But unfortunately, it seems like we continue to have these conversations. Look, before we let you go, I did want to ask you what you wish the public knew about victim survivors and what they go through, and what we can do to be better advocates for victim survivors in our own communities.
I believe that the best way you can support a woman who's been through the violent situation at the hands of mostly men is to believe her. So when she's coming forward, when she's finally got brave enough, like my self-esteem went from 100 to 0 within a couple of weeks, when she's, you know, so frightened and didn't believe even myself. So when you get the gumption up to actually reach out to someone, you need to be believed. That first phone call to 1-800-RESPECT needs to be not triaged, and you need to be believed and understood. When you go into a police station, you need that police officer to absolutely take you seriously. We don't make this shit up. Believing women, supporting women, respecting women and their stories, and keeping her safe and making sure that the perpetrator is removed from that situation and removed from harm. I do think actually having extended supervision orders and restrictions on movements and ankle bracelets, electronic trackers, they do help. If someone's hell-bent on coming to murder you, they will. But having restrictions in, 90% of the cases actually does provide a modicum of support. We need more money for safe homes, and we've got to not tolerate bad behaviour at every level. Guys in pubs talking to each other, those attitudes about women are the ones who are just as bad as men in divorce cases and things like that. It just doesn't pay out in the statistics. So we've got to change those attitudes that women are the aggressors, the perpetrators, the controllers of these situations. It's just not, the evidence is just not there.
Kay, thank you so much for speaking to us today and sharing your story as well. We appreciate your time.
Thanks so much.
That was Kay Schubach, a victim survivor, speaking to me there. And a reminder, support is always available. If you need advice, you can call the free National Domestic Violence Hotline on 1-800-RESPECT. If you are in immediate danger, dial 000. And if you need to talk to someone, call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or 13 Yarn. Thanks for listening to today's briefing. That is all for this morning. Before you go, though, we'd really appreciate it if you could share this ep with someone you think might get something out of it. And if you want to see our other content, make sure you check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We also upload full chats and episodes to YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. And we're also on TikTok, of course. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you next time.
Listener.